My name is Jon Faine. I'm a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne, which is a cross between being court jester and resident provocateur. And it's an absolute pleasure and an honour to be invited to do things like this, which are at the cutting edge of some of the big questions of our time. The format is very simple. In the middle is Deborah Glass OBE, yes, who served with distinction for 10 years as the Ombudsman in Victoria, and as she will explain, on a fixed term tenure, which is a point in itself of discussion. She is just, I think, right now, I think her pass was cancelled today, she's finished a 1-year position here at the law school, and is astonished that she can't get through the glass doors anymore, but we all get used to that eventually. And then Will Partlett, who is an associate professor here and whose distinguished research started with studying the Russian constitution and its debasement under Vladimir Putin, which of course was unique to Russia. It would never happen anywhere else, would it? And our most recent podcast, in fact, was about the parallels between what Putin did in Russia and what Trump is doing in the United States. Our format is incredibly straightforward. I've got a series of questions for each of them, and then it's open to the floor. And as I look around the room, there are people here who could just as easily be up the front as our two distinguished speakers today. And we want to draw on the wisdom of crowds. And whether you're someone who's done this work for a lifetime or you're a student, we equally value your contributions today. So we're looking forward to it. I'd also like to acknowledge, of course, at the beginning that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And on a personal note, I express my disappointment at the outcome of that referendum and my hope I live long enough to see it revisited and decided in another way. I don't think I need to expand terribly much on what democracy in decline might mean. Are our constitutional protections enough? We will focus not so much on endless and distressing repetitions of how bad things are in some parts of the world. We're particularly interested in the uniqueness of an Australian democracy where we have not just compulsory voting, but enforced compulsory voting. There's only a handful of countries in the world with compulsory voting, even fewer. I think it's 9, is that right? I think it's 9 countries with compulsory voting, and only 5 or 6, I think it is, that enforce it the way we do. It really makes us different and special. And then things like independent electoral commissions, which are above the fray, and so on, and the independent agencies, the accountability agencies that we're going to talk about, make our democracy less prone to some of the interference that we're seeing in continental Europe, certainly in the United States and all other places around the world. But when we get to the open discussion, I hope that we're able to come up with some suggestions and some solutions, not just a collective whinge, because I don't know how you all feel, but I know I find myself despairing, and I don't need to be sent further into despair. I need to be lifted from it, if that's at all possible. Deborah's been doing some really interesting research here, which is the subject of a podcast that we recorded recently, which is not yet out, is that right? No, they're coming out. We're doing them on the drip, so it looks like I work much harder than I actually do. And there's one which goes through the research you've been doing here. Take us through it briefly, because we'll come to it in detail later on.
Well, very briefly, the loose working title I gave it is How Independent Are They Really? And I've been looking at the, every jurisdiction in Australia, every state and territory and Commonwealth has the 3 independent integrity officers, the Auditor General, an Ombudsman and an Anti-Corruption Commissioner. So there are 27 in total, and they are all appointed, funded and overseen in different ways. So I've looked at, across Australia, how they're appointed, funded and overseen, and with a particular look at how close are they to executive government.
And there's no consistency or uniformity?
No consistency whatsoever, and it will not surprise you if I could just jump very quickly to the core conclusion that in all 3 of these dimensions of independence, as I call them, they are connected to the executive. So how independent are they really? So I mean, there are pockets of really good practice around Australia. There are different ways that these things are done. But there's a fundamental question about why should they be so different? I mean, these are agencies that essentially perform the same role in every jurisdiction. And we rely on them, we the public, in so many important ways for public trust.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in more detail later on, I'm sure. Well, we've posed a question in the title, Democracy in Decline, are our constitutional protections enough? We've kind of assumed everyone's going to furiously agree with the premise that democracy is in decline. So give us a little kind of a barometer of how far we are how steep is the slope of decline?
Let me start then with what do we mean by democracy in decline? And part of as Jon mentioned, my research path is a little unusual. I wrote a book on Russia and its kind of authoritarian legalism. And I ended up writing a book that has now increasingly helping me understand a place like the United States and many other parts of the world. And so what we actually have is authoritarianism is changing. So 50 years ago, authoritarianism was often a military coup. It was extra legal. It was individuals seizing power through a party state apparatus or something like that. And they often wouldn't operate through law. In recent decades, we've seen, and Russia is probably one of the oldest examples of this, we've seen the use of law as an authoritarian tool and method. And this is now spreading around the authoritarian world. So when we mean, and this is actually dangerous for democracies, right? Because it allows, they can create the veneer of what looks like a liberal democratic system with elections and courts and legislatures and all kinds of things like that. But you actually have highly authoritarian forms of power. And what do I mean by authoritarian forms of power? Centralization of power in the office of the elected leader, who's generally the head of the executive branch. And we're seeing this, so that's the problem, right? There's democracy in decline in established democracies like the United States or Australia is a problem of executive centralization. And the elected leader, whether it's the premier here in Victoria or anywhere else in the state system or the prime minister, either party, are over time we've seen the centralization of authority. And this is, obviously it's happening on a very dramatic scale in the United States with the office of the United States president and the radical approaches that Trump and his administration are taking to try to centralize authority there. But we're seeing similar activity, similar phenomenon happening in Australia around these offices of elected leaders. Cabinet gets less important. Parliament gets thrown out and becomes a rubber stamp. Watchdogs like electoral committees or ombudsmen are appointed or underfunded in certain ways so that they're controllable by the executive. All right, so the problem we have is one of executive centralization amidst elections, amidst all kinds of other things. So that's the problem we're dealing with, I think. And what some people have even called in Australia, what we have a kind of presidentialization of Australian politics problem, right? Where we have a prime minister or a premier, depending on the state or federal system, who are exercising vast authority, and really their office is where the power lies in a way that is really undermining a lot of the conventions of Westminster government, responsible government, and so forth. And I think that's really the problem I think we're working with.
But plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same thing. Joe Bjelke-Petersen was autocratic. Jeff Kennett, if people remember, was utterly autocratic. In fact, at times his ministers didn't know what he was deciding. They'd find out through the media, and they would tell you in the media, where I worked, that we found out from you. And Henry Bolte was very autocratic. So does it come in waves?
Yeah, I think, and Joe Bjelke-Petersen, obviously after that there was a big inquiry and the creation of an anti-corruption commission and a series of watchdogs in the Queensland context to overcome that. We see that same in New South Wales with the ICAC creation. So we got a response after the 1980s at the state level.
So the pendulum swings.
Yeah. But I think where we exist now is a much less kind of international kind of situation where we have a lot less support for accountability and responsible forms of government now than we probably did in the 1980s, where we were kind of entering into a democracy upswing. We're on a democracy downswing, and attacks, executive kind of aggrandizement of power now is probably more of a threat and probably something we need to talk about more, how to stop it.
All right, so what does it mean to you, Deborah?
Well, when I first encountered Will, which was the year after I finished my role as Ombudsman, it was fascinating. We were co-presenting at a seminar, and we were sort of comparing what we were going to say. And Will, of course, was talking about Putin's Russia, and I was talking about Daniel Andrews' Victoria. And we realised that we were both talking about centralisation of power and how that was taking over our lives. So, the kind of things, I mean...
Dan Andrews on a horse without a shirt on, no.
We don't have to go there, it's fine. But there are several examples I could pull out of the old kit of my former Ombudsman reports and other work. It's Operation Daintree, which started as an Ombudsman investigation, finished by IBAC, was all about the increased power of the Premier's private office. And what we saw in that particular investigation was that even the ministers weren't important anymore. I mean, what mattered was the ministerial advisors in Daniel Andrews' office who wanted to give a particular contract to a union. And it didn't matter what anybody else thought. It didn't matter that there were procurement processes that weren't being followed. So it was all about who had the power to award that contract. Well, it's a report that's in the public domain. I'm sure those with interest in these things are familiar with it. But that was one really powerful example of where the power lies in the state. The gift that keeps on giving from my last major report into politicisation was the good old suburban rail loop. We are still seeing those chickens come home to roost on a daily basis. Projects that are set up without the traditional public service scrutiny, without involving the people who are the traditional checks and balances for apolitical advice. And what we see there is that the power was sitting with the ministerial advisors and with consultants. That's where the advice came, and that's let's remove the traditional sources because it doesn't suit the narrative. And what's the price of that? Well, the last interest rate, the last interest budget numbers we were seeing was, I think, $20 million a day we're paying in interest. And what would that fund in public services? Just leave you with that thought.
Coming back to Will in a moment, but still with you, Deborah, Western Australia and now South Australia have virtually become one-party states. You're talking about Victoria, but what are your concerns about those jurisdictions where the political pendulum has swung so decisively one way?
Well, what particularly concerns me is the role that plays in the appointment of what ought to be the checks and balances that exist within the system. And the traditional checks and balances should, for example, be Parliament, they should be watchdogs. And how does that work?
And opposition, strong opposition.
Well, if there is, if they become one-party states, then actually there were times in my last role when I felt that I was the de facto opposition in the state, and that's not the role of the Ombudsman.
No, it's a worry. So, Will, let's go through centralisation of power. We've identified that it's an issue. Does it have a hallmark? Are there common characteristics that should be ringing alarm bells when we're seeing that happen across different types of constitutional structures?
Yeah, we're seeing, what I, in a prior book called kind of Constitutional Dark Arts, there's certain types of arguments that we see emerging, which is that, concentration of power in an elected leader is more responsive to the people and cuts out this what might be the deep state or unresponsive bureaucratic players or whatever. We have this personal relationship with the elected leader. It's seen as being more have a greater capacity to act in times of emergency, and obviously a lot of the centralization that we saw in Victoria was a response to the pandemic emergency that we had, and in some sense some of that needs to be snapped back, because there's always times of emergency do require centralization, but it's sometimes hard to pull back. Centralization is a one-way ratchet in many ways, and I think we see in Victoria a kind of example of that, and maybe arguably even in other parts and other jurisdictions in Australia as well. We've seen that kind of centralization. So it's seen as a kind of more decisive form of leadership, and institutionally it's almost always it's some kind of manifestation in the elected leader. So it can be a presidential system like you have, say, in the United States or Russia, or here it can be a parliamentary system, but a parliamentary system very much grounded in the office of the premier or the prime minister. And that's where what Deborah's saying, that the expansion of ministerial advisors in these offices is really unprecedented. I mean, the size of the Victorian PPO is huge compared to other Westminster systems.
To throw in, actually, it took us a while to work out the size because those numbers are not transparent; they weren't available. But we managed to get the data, and reported that the size of, certainly in 2022, when we looked at this, the size of the Premier's office in Victoria was greater than the Australian Prime Minister's and New South Wales Premier's offices combined.
But there was an explanation for that, which was that the Premier in Victoria, in his department, has all the media advisors and press secretaries centralised. In the Commonwealth bureaucracy, they're decentralised. So you're not quite comparing an apple to an orange when you look at that.
But they're still working for one.
They are centralised, and yes, you will often hear from a minister their frustration that they're not allowed to announce something in their own portfolio until it goes through the Premier's office. But it is, I mean, it's a very compelling stat.
It is.
But it's not quite, it's not entirely going to survive close scrutiny.
Well, I'll accept that there may be differences in the way these numbers are constructed, but they're still valid numbers.
It is astonishing, and that's a trend that's been underway for a long time.
Can I give one more example?
And so, just to finish that thought, we see it as a criticism and a weakness. I hate to tell you this, but in other jurisdictions, they say, "Oh, we should be more like them," and they're all going down that path. Sorry, Will.
That's part of the worry.
That's the logic. This is very powerful one-way logic. I mean, the other example, of course, which, so we're not just focusing on Victoria, but at the Commonwealth level, I mean, we saw Scott Morrison appointing himself to numerous ministries, right? And, again, another example where he saw no problem in that.
Nor did the Governor-General.
Yes, well, the Governor-General signed off on those. Yep. Maybe that's what Governor-General should do, it's apolitical. But, the point is, like, the Prime Minister should know better than that. Yep. Including signing himself on to many of these ministries, which he didn't, the others who were actually co-ministers with him did not know, right? So,
and really his supposedly independent, fearless public service heads did what?
Oh, they
went along with it.
Yeah. As we know from now, the robo-debt, now that they've finally published a lot of the robo-debt findings from Catherine Holmes, which how much fear and centralization is within the Victorian, or was within the public service in general, right? And this is the Commonwealth, and you've obviously written about the fear, and the word fear, it comes out of your report on the Victorian public service. So the public service, which is in some ways meant to be a check on the centralization of power, is now really vertically integrated into this
Victorian problem.
Yeah, so another example of we can just think of the dimensions, institutional dimensions of centralization we see here.
So Deborah, where is the system of checks and balances failing to meet that challenge of the centralisation of power in the office of either the Prime Minister or the Premier?
Well, let me give you an example of where we expect Parliament. So Parliament should be a check on the executive, right? I mean, this is, parliamentary core principle of Westminster democracy. How many people are familiar with what happened with the IBAC committee a few years ago? I
assume nothing.
Well, this is okay. So let me just tell you a brief story about this. So the oversight committee for IBAC, the Anti-Corruption Agency in Victoria, was a typical parliamentary committee, typically, as it always was, controlled by the government of the day. The requirement came in a few years ago that the integrity agencies, in line with their newfound budget independence, which wasn't real independence, needed to be audited by an independent performance auditor. And IBAC was then was the first to be subject to a performance audit. The committee, the parliamentary committee, has a subcommittee that is responsible for that audit. The auditor, the parliamentary committee then put its report out some year or so later, tabling the auditor's report. And as part of that report, there was a minority report from 2 Liberal members of the committee to say that basically this was a stitch-up. That all of this is on a public record, by the way, you can read these reports in Parliament, that this was, that that they did not approve the report, they didn't engage with it, and I think I've jotted down some of the language here, that the auditor's report was not independent. And they attached an email from the chair of the subcommittee which directed the auditor to make changes to the report. Actually, it wasn't just a please do, it was I'm directing you to do this, including such things as removing reference to funding from the recommendations. I don't think it was particularly noticed at the time. These things often aren't. These are reports that are tabled in Parliament.
Sometimes
But,
50 or 60 at a time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, on the same day.
Yeah, but this was in October 2022, which was not long before Robert Redlick's, who was the then IBAC Commissioner's term, was about to end. So Robert Redlick was so enraged by this, and rightly so, that just before his term ended in 2022, he wrote to the presiding officers, and he claimed, and again I'm quoting from his letter, which is now in the public domain, that the Labor members of the committee had directed the auditor to find dirt on IBAC, and that the chair and the majority of the committee seemed intent on casting IBAC in a negative light for what we can only assume are political reasons. And at the time, of course, IBAC was doing a lot of investigations into the government, you know, highly sensitive, ones that were involving, it was said, the Premier and senior ministers. So, and he recommended in his letter to the presiding officers that there should be reform to this committee. Now, for reasons that I don't know, and I don't think have ever been fully explained, this letter only emerged in February of the following year after Robert Redlick had ceased to be the IBAC Commissioner. And there was and it created something of a storm in Parliament. It was described by one of the MPs, I didn't make a note of who this was, you know, that the committee was operating a protection racket for the executive, which I thought actually was quite an interesting expression. And there was a lot of parliamentary debate here. The response, which I had to replicate because I just found it remarkable. Daniel Andrews' response was, "I'm not having a debate with a bloke who used to run an agency who's apparently written a letter that I haven't seen."
It's a fairly comprehensive response.
Yeah, yeah. So this actually, you know, this actually was the government that appointed Robert Redlick, but let's let that one pass. So anyway, so what happened? So there's a furor now. There's debate going on. You've got the Premier trying to park this, but of course, the government doesn't control the upper house, and there was a push for an inquiry into the Redlick letter.
Led by, I think, the Greens?
Probably,
Tim Reid, I think, wasn't it, in the upper house?
I don't know whether what the Greens did.
Tim Reid in the upper house, yeah. Who sadly is not contesting with ill health. He's ending his term in the Parliament.
Well, I think it was the inquiry was being proposed by the opposition, but Tim Reid did actually secure a deal with the government, and this is the point of the story actually, that rather than have this inquiry, which would be deeply embarrassing, certainly for the government, but that there wouldn't be an inquiry provided that the oversight committee would no longer be chaired by the government, and actually that it then became chaired by Tim Reid. And eventually, that change was secured in legislation. So this means that Victoria is actually the only state the only jurisdiction, in fact, that has an oversight committee on its integrity bodies that, by law, must be independent.
And it really makes you wonder the lengths to which the government was prepared to go to avoid an inquiry by surrendering a very powerful asset, which was chairing of the Oversight Committee, to an independent rather than go through what might come out.
Just this little, I think more broadly, conceptually, we can think of this is just executive thinking. It controls Parliament, right? The Parliament is just there, you know, they won the election, so Parliament is, to the extent to which, you know, that's our institution. This is why upper houses, if we think again of what's really distinctive and really, I think, important to support in the Australian context is these proportionally elected upper houses who really do play an important role. And if we're thinking about where do they get support, where do integrity institutions get support, it's those upper houses. But the lower houses, or unicameral places like Queensland, the government of the day just treats Parliament like it's, not with contempt, but they guillotine bills through there. You know, there's no debate. There's very little committee work in the lower houses at all. And without the upper houses, we really would be in an elective despotism. You win the election every 3 years, and that's it. That's the only accountability you get.
I would just add, because this also came out in the research, that although Victoria must have an independent chair, there are a number of parliamentary committees around Australia that by convention, as opposed to legislation, are moderately bipartisan and some of them are even independent. But you know, the question we then have to ask is, can we rely on convention?
No, we can't. And just park this thought as we're seeing the possible demise of the two-party monopoly or duopoly and the rise of community independence and Teals, dare I say it, One Nation and other players, some of the argy-bargy and the bargains that get made will probably change in the future, but that's venturing into the realm of political science rather than administrative law and the rest. Let's move on. Question without notice, Will. To what extent do some of these distortions, if I can call them that, come about because of the charismatic, powerful leader that we've been talking about, the Kennett, the Bjelke-Petersen, the Trump?
The Andrews. I mean, Andrews was very charismatic, particularly during the pandemic. I think those press conferences, everyone remembers them, very charismatic.
North Face jacket?
Yeah, I mean, that's right.
So to what extent do you think they go in partnership?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this goes to something I mentioned earlier, which is people have been talking, not just me, many people have been talking about the presidentialization of Australian politics, and not just, you know, presidentialization generally of Westminster-style parliamentary systems where, you know, voters associate much more now with a leader rather than with maybe their actual representative or who represents them in their constituency. So as we move in that direction informally, then I think we move towards more centralization of power, as it becomes kind of normalized that, you know, that we have, you know, the leader is the one who decides rather than a leader of the party actually kind of in cabinet kind of getting to some kind of consensus.
The whole point, though, of a written constitution is to make a system that is more robust and less vulnerable to the interventions of a charismatic leader, is it not?
Well, but I mean, every written constitution is incomplete, and particularly a constitution like Australia's is replete with numbers of conventions that are critical to its functioning. And I think one of the things that we've just been talking about is the erosion of those conventions, responsible government, the idea that Parliament holds the executive to account. That was much more possible when you didn't have very robust forms of political party discipline that you do now, that you didn't have these integrated parties that tolerate very little dissent. Australian political parties tolerate dissent in a very low level comparatively in the world. So yeah, we have a lot of the you know, the kind of conventions that make up this system are eroding. So that then goes to what do we do? How do we start to fix that? Institutionally, legislatively, because the conventions of Westminster are, as they start to erode, you know, need to be replaced in some way.
So Deborah, you were in the chair for 10 years and a critical 10 years here in Victoria. How often did you sit down and either on or off the record compare concerns with the Auditor-General or with the head of IBAC or other people who are in the integrity game?
A lot. It's a very lonely place being the head of an integrity agency. And the only places you can go, really, the only people you can talk to are your peers who occupy sort of similar positions in either in the same state or elsewhere. So certainly as far as IBAC and the Auditor-General were concerned, we did quite a bit of work together. I think we could have done more. There's always more you can do, but with IBAC particularly, I had an excellent relationship with the first two commissioners, and Operation Watts was a joint investigation of IBAC.
Remind people what that was about.
That was branch stacking. It involved, it was one of the the many reasons that I perhaps was not flavour of the month with the government of the day, but
Flavour of the
it was
decade.
flavour of the decade. These were not investigations I looked for. They were sent to me by Parliament. And when Parliament sends it, of course by the upper house, although interestingly in this case, it was a motion brought by Adam Somyurek. Anyway, that's a whole other, complication we could discuss outside of this. That wasn't. The politicisation was brought, beg your pardon, take that one back.
Red shirts, yeah.
The branch stacking investigation was a first of its type, where we did a joint investigation, an ombudsman and anti-corruption commissioner together, to come up with what I think was a uniquely powerful set of recommendations that I suspect neither IBAC nor I could have achieved on our own. So these things are possible, but they are dependent on personalities. You've got to be willing to work together. You've got to want to work together. But we did.
You were appointed by the Baillieu or Napthine government, the Napthine government, and then shortly after the administration lost the election and you became the Ombudsman of the first and successive Andrews governments. Did you meet with the Premier, Denis Napthine, when you were appointed?
After I was appointed, I met him. And all he really wanted to know was what football team I supported.
Good. When Daniel Andrews became Premier, did you meet with him?
No.
Ever?
I met him when he was leader of the opposition, interestingly. But so after I was appointed. But after he became Premier, I did not meet him at all. I had one conversation with him when we put out the branch stacking report, when he rang to tell me and Robert Redlich the day of our press conference that he was accepting all of our recommendations and he wanted us to know before the press conference.
And that was the only time you had a conversation with him personally?
That's right.
Did you meet with other senior members of the government?
I did meet with the Special Minister of State, Gavin Jennings, on a moderately regular basis, but that was really very
Who was
tricky.
sort of the minister?
Well, he was also the subject of one of my referrals from Parliament, so it's quite difficult when the minister and I did say this about my funding, I think I used the word awkward. It is awkward to have, to have a relationship with of any sort with the government you've been asked to investigate. And particularly he was one of our subjects. I mean, he was under investigation. That's particularly awkward.
Have you spoken to him since, Gavin Jennings?
I did speak to him after that, yes, we did have.
After he left Parliament?
I have spoken to him since he's left Parliament, yes.
Cordially?
Yes.
It's very engaging.
Yes.
It's good company. And what about Mr. Andrews? Have you met with him?
No.
Do you think you ever will?
I very much doubt it. It really began to feel personal,
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, it's because I put out quite a few reports over the COVID period, and when he was doing his daily press conferences with a North Face jacket and was he was facing down the press pack, he would get asked periodically about my reports.
Into the high-rise
Whatever it
apartments,
was,
North
whether
Melbourne?
it was the public housing towers or, the business support fund or the closure of the borders or whatever, annoyance I had produced for, the government of the day. And you could always see him sort of visibly sort of shake himself and go, well, the Ombudsman is independent and the Ombudsman is entitled to her opinion, or something along those lines. But I really got the impression that I got under his skin.
You weren't alone. We've used up most of the time without having got to the nub of it, which is, okay, there's the problems. Now what do we do? And then I'm going to throw it, so I'll ask you each to address that, and then I'll throw it open. There's a manageable number of us here. I'll take hands in the order I see them, and I'll try and share it around as much as possible. And the only caution, if you could introduce yourself, if you're comfortable doing that, that would be good. But the only caution is, if you want to sing a song, recite a poem, make a speech, I'll probably cut you off after a few minutes. And if you can give some context if you need to, but a question rather than a long contribution from the floor would be good. And we'll try and get as many people to participate as want to here in the room before we run out of time. So having identified the problem, having illustrated some of the shortcomings, what do we do, Will? How do we strengthen the structures that create the foundations of our resilient democracy?
Well, luckily we don't have to invent them, right? They exist. There are these integrity watchdog institutions, ombudsmen, anti-corruption commissions, auditor generals, electoral commissioners, and so forth. We have a long tradition in Australia of independent watchdog. And in many ways, they've been created by Parliament, at least as I understand it, from a constitutional point of view. They've been created by Parliament to reassert its role in our system of responsible government. So we, often, in other contexts in the world, you think of, courts are the kind of the key thing holding back the executive. In Australia, we have a really unique and I think actually quite powerful response, which is we do use courts. And obviously, if the powers that be, the executive, act illegally, we can hold them accountable in courts. But when they act maybe, with gray corruption or in ways that we don't like, or they're not following procedures or so forth, we have all kinds of other institutions, these watchdogs. And they are, even though they're not in the Constitution, they're not constitutionally there, they're part of our unwritten Constitution, and they play a really significant role. And I think some of the work that Deborah and I are doing, and I do at Center for Public Integrity, is how do we make these institutions work better? Because as we've heard from Deborah's experiences, executives don't like these institutions, particularly when they feel justified in what they're doing. They think they're getting in the way. I think I forget who said they always want more money. They always want more more power or this type of thing. But what they're essentially doing is exercising the role that Parliament no longer can. Parliament is fading away. A lot of its ways due to party discipline and other reasons because of fundraising and constant campaigning. But these institutions can play that role. So I think they're there. I don't think we have to invent them. We just need to figure out how to make them work better and more independently.
And how do we?
That's Deborah.
Well, we need to strengthen the independence of the processes that create and support those institutions. So appointment. This is something that is, we assume that these are independent integrity agencies. But in fact, and this comes out of the research, only 5 out of the 27 different independent integrity agencies that I've referred to are subject to an independent appointment process. So, and that's pretty remarkable. That's all 3 in the ACT, by the way, which definitely wins the award for the best processes around Australia, and the Western Australian and Queensland anti-corruption commissions. But here in Victoria, for example, there is absolutely nothing other than convention to prevent the government appointing whoever it likes to these positions. And even when there's a parliamentary committee involved, as we've seen in numbers of other places around Australia, there's a parliamentary committee has an official right of veto or something, but the parliamentary committee is controlled by the executive, and so what? So we see a huge amount of inconsistency around Australia. There are some really good practices, and why can't we? Rhetorical question. Take those good practices and replicate them around Australia. Fundamentally, it's because politicians don't want to, but sort of we, the people, I think, need to keep that pressure on and remind ourselves why this is important.
So former Premier Jon Faine in Victoria introduced the first freedom of information legislation, and at the time I remember him saying, this is the sort of thing you only do in your first year in power. And I'm going to do it even though everyone's telling me I'm going to live to regret it. And people like Gareth Evans and others who followed, even on the Labor side, who believe in the principles, all end up saying, oh God, it's just such a nightmare, it's a disaster. So is it the sort of thing that you're talking about, strengthening integrity commissions through the type of processes, sort of thing that only oppositions will commit to and then implement when there's a change in government?
That's generally the experience. I mean, oppositions generally love integrity agencies because they have a go at the government of the day. And they will make promises about doing things when they get into government. And that's great. And that's when you do see the reform. So that's when you will get the new bodies come into place. And they're all there for a reason. Some of these anti-corruption commissions, for example, exist because there's been a scandal in that place, and there's a huge amount of public pressure to create a body in Queensland or WA and New South Wales. ICAC was the result of scandal. But IBAC actually wasn't, and that's part of the problem, you know, that it was kind of, oh, no, everybody else has one, so we think we probably ought to, but let's not give it too much power, let's not give it too much, and let's give it a really high threshold for public hearings and so on.
And a misleading name.
So, you know, so they're all, you know, we are all products of history, and the reason, of course, there are so many different approaches is precisely that. But
briefly come in?
Yeah.
And this takes in the time component as well. If you have one party that's in power for a very long time, you see it dwindling. And we can see that potentially, arguably, with the Commonwealth government now, which won the 2022 election, the integrity election, created the National Anti-Corruption Commission, created a number of, you know, ART reformed and so forth, but we now see as having a much more checkered accountability record.
There's three things that come to mind, and then I'm going to look for hands jumping up. Another way to nobble an integrity agency is to appoint someone who you know is utterly incompetent and not up to the job. And I'm not being defamatory, but there is an example in Victoria of exactly that happening, and the person who was appointed admits they weren't the right person for the job. They applied for it thinking they'd never get it. They were given it. They did it to the best of their ability, which was not very well, and they freely admit that they think they were appointed in order to make the organisation fail. And for those of you wondering, I'm talking about the Police Complaints Authority, created in the late 1980s. Hugh Selby, an academic from Canberra, was appointed to be the authority. He was assisted by a young, wet behind the ears researcher by the name of Ian Freckleton. And within years, having created an independent police complaints authority, it was disbanded. And the police union went, "You beauty." We agreed to it, we nobbled it, we got rid of it. No one's going to do that again in a hurry. It's a really interesting example. But there's two, other than telling war stories and dwelling on old ancient history, there are two other aspects of integrity and checks and balances that have not yet been mentioned. And I'd like you both to comment. The media as a independent checker and balancer, and the occasional cleansing effect of a Royal Commission. Deborah.
There are times in the last couple of years where I thought that Nick Mackenzie is all that stood at us in the abyss, actually. So I am a huge fan of the media. I think the independent media is vital in our democracy. And when I was Ombudsman, I hugely valued the role the media played, including even your good self, John, now that I think
Not what you said at the time, no.
So, you know, one of the, my funding was not independent, and it was a constant battle year on year. And I've been quite public about this. I said, I think governments fund their integrity agencies by as little as they can get away with. And part of my role was to make sure they didn't get away with too much, and that was having conversations with people like John.
Yep.
Because, that it kept the profile of the organisation, and it just made it that much harder for them to, absolutely, to cut me down.
Yep. And Royal Commissions?
I'm not as big a fan of Royal Commissions as some. I mean, particularly because I do think, the Ombudsman has the powers of a Royal Commission other than public hearings, and can produce pretty powerful reports, I think. And there are some things where Royal Commissions are phenomenally expensive. So they've got to be saved for things that really, really justify them. And I've seen Royal Commissions that are fabulous, and others that are much less so. And there are times when I've thought, actually, why didn't the government send that to me? Because I could have done a pretty damn good investigation into that particular problem for a tiny fraction of the price.
Can I just add one institution to your list? Universities and university academics playing a role as well, arguably, in also holding accountable power through their research, through events like this.
There's a little bit of a conflict of interest there, Will.
I think that's self-interest, not conflict of interest, actually.
So, no, you're not wrong. The role of the academy and its expertise in shedding a light into a dark corner should not be overlooked. You're absolutely right. So I remind you, Will's new book is out, and keep an eye out for the sequel, which is How to Nobble Democracy, which is all the things he's learned that people with ill will are able to do. Could you, in the usual fashion, please thank our two wonderful speakers? And it's terrific that the uni puts this on. It's terrible that 40 or 50, maybe 40 people come along instead of 400 or 4,000. But you are all able to say, I was there at the first one of these. And when there's 40,000 people at the MCG talking about democracy, you can proudly say, yes, I was there at the start. So it is up to the people. And I remind you, progress is not inevitable, nor is it linear. It doesn't just happen, and it doesn't move smoothly along a path. It bounces around. And progress happens because people make it happen. And I leave you with that thought, and thank you all for coming along. There's some food to be finished off there, and thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.